All right, thank you everyone for coming back for the second part of this week's virtual session. So just now, Dr. Luisa have shared a little bit about how the scientific process and contributes to conservation and a little bit of the reality in terms of job scope and the work being done on the ground in terms of as a conservationist. All right, now we're moving on for the next part. We have Shantini to talk about conservation knowledge in terms of environmental governance and law perspective. So Shantini is actually a qualified lawyer and completed her degree in law from the University of Nottingham and also a master's in University of Nottingham. And she left the legal practice in early 2014 to pursue a career in marine policy manager with WWF. So she is now currently providing supporting role in policy for the marine program within WWF. Shantini, let me project your slide and we can you can take over the reef. Okay, screen. Let me just put. Hang on. Oops, I need to unshare. Okay, it's now on full screen. The first slide.
Right.
Yeah.
So Edmund, you'll be navigating the slides, right?
Yes, correct.
All right. Thank you so much. So good morning and almost afternoon to Reef Spawn and all the participants. And Reef Spawn, I really congratulate you on this effort. I wish I had a similar opportunity back in the day. And I think it may have sort of shaped my career path a little better. And participants, I hope you all benefit the most from this entire program. And I'm just here to share just a little of what I know about marine governance. I've been working in this field for about 7-8 years now with WWF-Malaysia. And I'm a classic case of what Dr. Luisa was saying. I don't have a science background at all, but now I'm working in conservation. So I'm trying to put my legal knowledge to use to help bring forward conservation goals and needs. So policy matters in our troubled waters. I'm going to give you just a very quick sneak preview into what the governance framework looks like in Malaysia. And also just give you a select flavor of some of the issues we encounter at the moment. Environmental governance per se is a very broad topic and it's got so many segments within it. So I'm just going to give you a cursory overview and I'm more than happy to take questions at the end. And I'm going to limit this mostly to the national context of law, institutions, and decision-making within the Malaysian context. So that's just introduction. Can I have the next slide? I'll just share. Next slide, please. Slide 2. I'll just show you the content, the scope. My presentation will cover just 4 key areas. And the first being where I'll just hopefully set the scene for you, where I will provide just a bit of background information. And then I will move on to just giving you an overview of what the governance framework in Malaysia looks like. I'll move on to some of the select issues faced by governance in terms of marine conservation. And lastly, I'll just share some of the way forward that I hope, or collectively what we should aspire for marine environmental governance in Malaysia. Thank you. Okay, so setting the scene, Dr. Luisa has already done an excellent job in sharing about conservation and science and conservation. So, slide 4, please.
Yep.
In essence, just a cursory question as to how big is our oceans? How many institutions do we know that is looking into marine affairs? And is there actually a focal institution for oceans in Malaysia? Any quick shout outs? Anybody wants to quickly shout out any of these answers?
Marine.
Okay, go ahead, Sri.
Anyone? You need to speak so that Shantini can hear.
I think it's marine surface.
Yeah, okay, marine surface is larger, that's right.
Yeah.
And how about number of institutions or agencies overseeing? You can give me like a more than 5, more than 10, that sort of a number.
I think around 4.
Okay, all right. So yeah, just hold on to that figure for now. And then the last one was, is there an institutional home? Is there an actual agency looking into ocean matters? Since it's, so big, it's a large part of our nation. Yes or no?
I hope so.
Okay, valid question. Well, okay, fine. Thanks for the response. We will see where we stand with respect to the second and third question as we go through the presentation. Yeah. All right. Next, please.
Yep.
All right. So our marine environment, like we already spoke about what are the components in conservation earlier. So governance has many meanings, but the one for today's presentation, what I would like to stick with is actually the overall interaction between policies, laws, and institutions in trying to manage the relationship between the 3 factors you see here. The ecological physical structure, the ecological functions and composition, be it your species, your habitats, and then you have biochemical processes. So you have like nutrient cycling when the water brings nutrients to shore. So again, I'm not a scientist, but there's a lot of functions like climate regulation, nutrient cycling that the environment contributes towards. And lastly, obviously, human activity. Human activity interacts with all these 2 other processes. And marine environmental governance seeks to enable management through laws, policies, and institutions. So that's the angle we will be looking at today. Next, please. All right, very quickly. When we say marine environment, how many layers are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Anyone? Just give a shout.
5.
Okay, what are the 5? Whoever said the 5 just now. Go for it. Just take a stab.
Like vertically or horizontally?
Yeah.
Vertically is like pelagic, epipelagic, mesopelagic, abyssal zone. I can't remember one more.
Okay, no worries. Okay, thank you very much. Even I don't know any of those. So basically, in more layman's term, we have the air column, we have the water surface, we have the water column, the seabed, and then we have the subsoil. So that's in very layman terms. I'm not sure about the So that's you have 5. And why this is important is when we talk about, say, land management or governance of the land surface is pretty much more 2D because you have just the surface of the land, which is forest, which is an incline and so forth. But with oceans, you have so many layers. Next slide, please.
Shantini, sorry, maybe can you get closer to the mic?
I actually right in front of my mic.
Okay.
No.
Because okay, now it's better. Yeah. Yeah. Can go on.
All right. So your slide 7, right?
Yes,
right.
multiple
so
users
now here
and
we
users.
See
yeah.
that in each zone, you actually see that there are multiple. This is just a select number of users who are present in each zones. And this is just looking at human activity. I'm not even looking at what is the biodiversity or environmental composition within this layer. So these are the different people who all are interested in a slice of cake within this different layers, right? All right, so next, please. So now what happens when we have so many users interested in all these layers at the same time? Then obviously it gives rise to all these possible activities. You discharge substances, you want to exploit, you want to explore, and next slide, please.
Yep.
So these will then result in threats. So we have unprecedented rates of habitat loss, species loss, pollution, and so forth. So these are all what you know, right? So I'm just setting the scene here. All right. So now I'm just going to now, if you want to manage this environment, these are the key questions you need to be aware of, right? Dr. Louisa already mentioned about, some of these questions. So knowing what your environment is, knowing the composition, knowing how they contribute, and science is what determines management, right? So then you then identify what are your environmental or conservation goals. And based on these goals, you need to also then, from a policy perspective, the angle of society, economy, politics, human rights comes in. Because for instance, if say I want to create a law to conserve or protect an area, will I be excluding a select community or a select group of actors from exercising an existing right? Will I be depriving someone from an economic activity? So when we want to develop a policy or promulgate a law, there are socio-economic considerations to also be added on in trying to achieve our conservation goals. Can I have the next slide, please?
Yep.
So then these are the range of measures. We need to also be aware of range of measures that are available to achieve your conservation goals. And these measures will be made enforceable or will be made implementable either through a regulatory framework, through laws, through policies, through conditions in licenses. And these can range from protected areas to industry-specific regulations. So for example, if it's fishing, am I going to prohibit a certain type of fishing gear from being used? And so forth. I mean, there would even be finance measures. So if I'm going to provide, say, a subsidy, I'm a government agency and I'm looking to provide a subsidy, will this subsidy actually encourage destructive habits? So an example is, say, if fisheries are all already at its limit at the moment, but we have an entire group of coastal communities who are currently below 40 in terms of their income group. So we want to provide them a form of subsidy so that A, they can continue their livelihoods and they can earn a decent living and they can exercise their other human rights. But B, there's also pressure on the environment. So would giving them larger engines with larger capacity to go out to fish be contrary to fishing conservation related goals? And in the long run, will it actually help the community? So these are like some of the tools that are there, but we still need to consider the parameters from the previous slides. So in the realm of governance, these are all the range of actors. When we say policy, law, we say institutions, we usually think, oh, government, oh, lawmakers, oh, enforcement agencies. But no, every single person who's breathing and walking is actually accountable, because so long as you are using a component of the environment, be it marine or terrestrial, you have a responsibility and you have a role to play. So there is self-governance. You can actually manage your own conduct. Like we have policies and laws to not litter, but people still do litter, right? So every single agency, finance institutions are increasingly adopting ESG, environmental, social, and governance related principles in their finance instruments. And the rest are pretty straightforward, enforcement agencies and so forth. So we all have our roles. We need to know that these are the key components, the actors, the measures, the conservation goals. So these are the parameters with which I'll move forward. Yeah, next, please.
Yes.
So in Malaysia, what is our governance framework? So this is not unique just to marine. This is a broad overview of governance in Malaysia. So we look at it from an institutional perspective. Institutions have a tiered approach in Malaysia, which means there is the federal agencies, federal government, state governments, and local governments. Each of these governments have respective responsibilities, mandates, and scope of work at different levels. Some would be at an overview at a national level, range of purview, and similarly for state and local. So local governments would be like your local municipalities and so forth. Next, please. So similarly, the legal framework also, we have a range of laws in Malaysia, but we are a constitutional monarchy. So the the most supreme of all our laws would be the Federal Constitution. And that's like the rule book for all rules and all conduct in Malaysia. It sets out how laws are to be made, who can make the laws, how are institutions to some extent be formed, how are finance generally to be distributed. So the Federal Constitution is at the top because it dictates and it charts how every other legal development in Malaysia would happen at a structural level. Then you have federal laws. Again, federal government makes federal laws, and state and federal governments make laws through the parliament. I'm guessing you guys would know that. And state laws are made through the state legislative assembly. And then you have bylaws which are passed by local governments. So then within the laws, there are various categories. So you have formal laws. You have main parent laws, which are the primary source of laws. Another form of law is subsidiary laws, which are legislation that are made from a parent act. So for example, we have a federal act on fisheries. And now the Fisheries Act would provide for code of conduct, for general code of conduct of fisheries. Who can fish where? We are giving out licenses for what? What is prohibited? That's the general. But see, now there's a specific problem in fishery. There is a specific gear that is deemed to be very, very destructive. So they can come out with specific rules under the Fisheries Act, and that's called subsidiary legislation. Generally, subsidiary legislation is much easier when you want to review and amend a primary legislation. A parent act, like a federal act, has to go through the parliamentary system, so it takes longer. So that's just the general process of law in a very nutshell. Next slide. So then, while I said that our federal constitution actually shapes the structure of our law, the content and substance of marine environmental laws or environmental laws are largely influenced by our international commitments. So Malaysia, as a sovereign, as a country that is recognized internationally, we can take part in international decision-making process and international law-making processes, which we do, and these give rise to conventions, which are international laws. So when Malaysia agrees or subscribes to a particular law, they will either ratify or accede. So they will sign on to this piece of convention or law. And very quick question again, if Malaysia signs on to say a law like the Convention on Biological Diversity, does it mean that it automatically becomes implementable in Malaysia? Is it immediately effective? Anybody quickly? Yes?
I guess no.
Okay. Who said that?
Howard.
Okay, Howard.
Yep.
All right. So that's right. That's absolutely right. It's never automatically in effect. So there's a lot of presumption that people say that, oh, that's the governing law in Malaysia once a convention is signed. It's not. It has to be transposed into a national piece of law. So for example, elements of the Convention on Biological Diversity can be found in the Wildlife Conservation Act. Elements of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea can be found in the Fisheries Act, in a range of other acts. So it has to be transposed. But the question is, when we sign onto all these conventions, have every single obligation been effectively delivered through national laws, or are there gaps? I'll tell you the answer. It's usually there will be some gaps. And also at the international level, not all instruments are binding. So the conventions are binding, but you have something like the Sustainable Development Goals. That's voluntary in nature. So countries can sign on to it, but it's voluntary. So they don't have a legal obligation to deliver, but it's a collective aspiration. So we still work on it. Okay. And next, please. Why I'm focusing on this convention UNCLOS is because this is deemed to be the constitution of the sea globally. It's the most comprehensive piece of international law that covers the entire governance of oceans, ranging from environmental protection, conservation, to shipping, to seabed mining, So it covers the entire range of activities. It also determines states' eligibility or ability to draw up their marine boundaries. So it also defines how you draw up your marine boundaries. These are some of the key provisions relating to marine conservation that are in the convention, ranging from pollution control, species and habitat protection, and so forth. Next, please. So now just another overview. So now I've given you an overview of the governance framework. Now in terms of laws, there is also something called legal jurisdiction. Who can make laws and what type of laws can be made by whom? So legal jurisdiction can be divided somewhat into two. One is based on space, one is based on subject matter. Can I have the next slide, please?
Yep.
All right, so I'm going to skip ahead to the next one, please. All right, so now we're just going to consider, this is what I mean by space-based. So because the UNCLOS, the International Convention, allows us to define our maritime zones and boundaries, what we have in result of exercising those rights is Malaysia has claimed exclusive economic zone right up to 200 nautical miles from the land. So that's really far. And in some areas, it's probably less because it may coincide with an international boundary. So there are various rules as to how we draw up the external boundary of our exclusive economic zone. And we have claimed territorial seas of 12 nautical miles. Now, why this is important is because we need to be able to later understand who are the key governing bodies or agencies in these respective zones. So under national laws, we have already proclaimed that state waters would end at 3 nautical miles. So 0 to 12 is territorial seas, but up to 0 to 3, is considered state waters, and then 3 to 12 is territorial sea, and 12 to 200 is your exclusive economic zone. Then we have something called the continental shelf, which is basically the seabed and subsoil that runs from the territorial sea parallel to the exclusive economic zone. That's the general idea. And you have each of these zones has almost different agencies overseeing them at the moment. Next, please. So this is just to give you an idea of the exclusive economic zone. This is the range of activities that the Exclusive Economic Zone Act covers. It ranges from, again, pollution prevention to exploitation and fisheries. But what this act actually does, the Exclusive Economic Zone Act, in a large sense, a lot of these obligations and duties have been delegated out or appointed out to specific ministries. The remaining powers and functions within this act resides with the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. But specific rights, say for fisheries, it has been given out to Department of Fisheries. For pollution control and environmental issues, it's been given out to Department of Environment. So in the exclusive economic zone, Malaysia's rights is lesser compared to her rights in the territorial seas. So the further out to sea you go, you have lesser rights by international law, because there are other rights that we need to think about. Like, for example, if there is an international ship that's trying to go from country A to country C, but it has to pass Malaysian waters, they have rights to actually cross easily across the exclusive economic zone. There are more liberties. Next slide, please. So this is just to also just indicate that, again, then there are spatial specific laws for the continental shelf and also for the land, which is basically the seabed up to state waters, comes under state jurisdiction, and the continental shelf, it remains under federal entities. Next, please. All right, so again, now I'm going back closer to land or closer to national laws, which have the most implementation in terms of scope. The Malaysian fisheries waters it actually covers all of Malaysian waters, regardless whether it's state waters, territorial seas, EEZ. The Fisheries Act gives powers, and it's under the administration of the Department of Fisheries to manage fisheries within all of Malaysian waters. There's some exemptions, I will go to that later. And forestry and land code respectively, they cover these areas. So this is the spatial dimension. Next slide, please. So now we've already looked at space, right? So states can make laws within their space, and federal government can make laws for any areas within, for anything within their area. That's the area-based laws. Subject matter law is again a different thing. So the 9th schedule, we go back to the Constitution. What the Constitution has done is, it has then identified there are all these key subject matters, and no single entity will be in charge of all these areas. So they've decided through a list that, okay, these select items, only federal government can make laws. These select items, only state government, so it's called the state list. And then there's a group of select items which either federal or state authorities can make laws for. This is again the general rule. And if you see, you can see this is not a comprehensive list. This is just some of the selected subject matters relevant to the marine environment. And you can see that then again, governance in terms of lawmaking powers resides with two different entities, and some are shared. So the image on your right seeks to show how this from a spatial level, it interacts. So now what happens when you have two different entities who can make laws on a same area or an overlapping area? So the Federal Constitution then says, if there's any inconsistencies, federal law will prevail. But that does not mean that the federal law can take over some of the state subject matter. So state has, say, rights over inland fisheries. So it's 100% state's jurisdiction to oversee the management of inland fisheries. And states can choose to they can choose to opt to ask federal government to step in and make federal laws. There's some situations where this can happen lah. One is if two or more states think that, oh, two states have different laws, we want to harmonize it. We need more standardized laws, then that can happen. But for that to happen, if a federal law is put in place, the states must then adopt it. If the federal act is out, but states don't then come up with a state law, then it's like how earlier I mentioned, when you have an international convention, it doesn't automatically become effective in Malaysia. Similarly, if it's a state subject matter and there is a federal law, it will not be immediately effective in the state until and unless a state adopts it. So that's just some of the overview of the law-making process in Malaysia at the moment. All right. So this is just a summary of some of the laws that have been conceived out of our current 9th schedule system. And you can see that it's distributed across state, federal, and it's also by law and by policy, how it has come about. And an interesting fact to know is, for example, we saw that turtles was under the state list. So what has happened is, in Sabah and Sarawak, turtles have been captured under their wildlife enactments. In Peninsular Malaysia, turtles have been administered under their respective states where it's present. In Peninsular Malaysia, we have a Wildlife Conservation Act, but it does not cover marine species. And in Sabah and Sarawak, the wildlife enactment covers both marine and terrestrial species. So you have this level of somewhat of, not to say fragmentation, but different standards being applied across the states. And that's the benefit of having a federal state split in jurisdiction, but it can give rise to problems, which we will come to later. Next, 26. So this is just the overall scope of some of these laws. Fisheries Act, it when you say fisheries, generally you would think fisheries is the act of exploiting fish, so the act of managing fisheries, the activity of catching fish. But in Malaysia, it's a bit unique as well, because Fisheries Act not just covers the management of fisheries, it also looks into the conservation of fisheries, but there's also an entire section that looks into establishment of marine parks. Then you have a range of other policies, laws as well, which look into international trade of species. So marine environmental governance doesn't end at sea. There are things that can happen outside of the marine environment which have a bearing on the marine environment, right? So like trade of endangered species can happen outside of the marine environment once the species is taken out. So that has to be regulated. Then we can think about activities that happen in your coastal areas, coastal development, reclamation, and so forth. Activities like that can also impact your marine environment, marine ecosystem, and fisheries. So that's where the Town and Country Planning Act comes in, and they have developed at the national level a physical plan. It's called a national physical plan. And for those of you who don't know, this is actually a plan that looks into identifying land use and development needs of the entire country, right? So in these systems, that planning system would actually tell you what you can do in certain areas and what you can't do in certain areas. Next, please. So then we've looked into the legal system. Now, that's the legal framework, and we've seen that there's a tiered level of institution. But this tiered level of federal, state, and local, what their executive authority, as in what they can oversee in terms of administration from day to day, mirrors the night schedule of the federal. So it follows the federal constitution, the subject matter list. Federal looks into fisheries, so they will administer fisheries. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the institutions and their roles. I asked the question earlier, how many agencies or departments, and the answer, someone said maybe 4. In actuality, there are over 30 agencies in Malaysia that look into some form of marine related matter. But this number keeps shifting because more often than not, we actually see ministries being renamed. We see departments moving around. A good example is the Marine Parks Department used to be under the Ministry of Natural Resource and Environment. Then it got moved back to the Ministry of Agriculture. Now, one might think, what has marine parks got to do with agriculture? But that's just how the way it is, because fisheries comes under agriculture. And also, for example, enforcement used to come under the Prime Minister's department. Presently, I believe it comes under the Ministry of Home Affairs. So these agencies move around, but there's a whole range of them, and they are currently dealt with in a sectoral manner, meaning if I'm in fisheries, I will plan for fisheries and I will administer fisheries. There's not much interaction between the different sectors. There are some, but it's not to the extent desired. Next, please. So now we have so many laws in Malaysia. We have so many institutions, over 30 institutions, and I think even laws, if you count parent and subsidiary laws, you'll have more than 30, more than 50 pieces of legislation, both subsidiary and parent. Yet we have all these issues. Why? Overfishing, IUU, species loss. Any guesses? Just shout out if you're still with me.
Anyone?
Because most of the law are not streamlined.
Okay.
And sometimes they conflicting one another.
Okay, that's possible. That's possible. All right. Anyone else wants to share anything before I move on?
I think maybe the laws are not properly enforced.
Okay. All right. Valid point also. All right. So this section was just to give you an overview of governance framework of institutions and the legal arrangements in Malaysia. Can I have the next slide, please? All right, now I want to move into some of the issues related with governance through selected examples. So I'm going to first, next slide please, 31. Can you please raise your hand if you agree, and if you don't agree, then you don't raise your hands for each of these questions. So the first question is, if you know of a law, will you always abide by it? If you agree, please raise your hands. Edmund, can you do a quick count?
Yeah, come, let's raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Okay.
7 people raised their hand.
I thank you for being very honest in your answer. For those who did not raise your hand, so can I ask you why, for those who did not raise your hand, why would you abide by laws if you know about it? Can anyone who didn't raise their hand tell me, just one person maybe share why?
Come guys, or else I have to pick from the...
Or maybe they're not there.
Yeah, they put their hands down already.
Okay.
Very shy.
It's all right. Okay, so all right, second question. Okay, I'm not going to ask you why. So second question, will people always follow the law? Yes or no?
Raise your hands, come.
You
Only one
yes?
person. Only one person raised and he just put his hand down.
Okay, all right. Okay, then
No.
the third one, would you always be interested? Would you be willing to take part in any public survey? Oh no.
Session 2 slide environmental policy power.
Would you be willing to participate in any public surveys? Anyone? 2, 3, 4,
Yes.
5, yes.
5 said yes.
6, 7, yeah.
Okay, and then the last one is, would you give donation if you don't know the cause?
Okay, let's re-raise your hand. Would you give donation without knowing the cost? No. Most of them say no. Yeah.
Okay, very good. All right, so the reason I'm asking this question, it relates to, there are key elements that are related to governance, and it equally applies to environmental governance. Can I have the next slide, please?
Yes.
Okay. Just give me a minute. All right, so there are, in essence, 6 different elements, right, of environmental governance. And these will determine why people, this will determine a lot of issues. For example, access to information. If you don't have enough information, say for a public survey, you don't know the context, you don't know the content, then why would you participate in it? I know many of you said yes. So in an environmental governance situation, as a citizen of the country, won't you want to know what the state of your environment is? Won't you want to know what's causing destruction, or what's the rate of environmental related crimes in Malaysia? So that's part of the access to information part. So example, in land use planning, won't you want to know which areas can be fished, which areas cannot be fished? How many licenses are given out? That's important in decision making, one of it. Second is transparency. Now we have so many companies or private sectors or even governments. You're managing your activities in the marine environment. Are you disclosing information? Are you willing to disclose information? How much of fish are you catching from the sea? Are you catching limits which are exceeding ecological stocks? Are you catching more endangered species than you should be? Would you be willing to disclose? That's where transparency comes in. That's just an example. Then you have the fundamental one, rule of law. So the concept of rule of law actually means that everyone is equal in the eye of the law, which means if there is a law, you should and you ought to adhere to it, and it ought to be enforced. But there are challenges with respect to rule of law. Rule of law is a very important principle. Like if you create a law and it cannot be enforced, it will not just undermine that one law, but it will also undermine the entire legal system. Because then what's the point of having laws if you can't follow them, right? So it's very important when we create or develop a piece of legislation, A, it needs to be relevant. B, it needs to be something that can be implementable. So if you create a law, but there is no enablers to implement it, it becomes a problem. 3, if there's no enforcement, because we are all not self-governing individuals, right? I mean, not always, but sometimes. So I thank you for being honest earlier with question 1 earlier. If you know of a law, would you follow it? I think maybe slightly more than half would raise your hands. So if there's no one enforcing, there's no big brother watching, would we actually comply? If it's too difficult for you to comply, you may not comply. So again, that's where the rule of law comes in. Then you have, hold on now. You have matters like public participation. Now, when you're developing a policy or a law, you need to create the platform to actually solicit input from actors. Remember, we spoke about actors earlier. So we need to get information from actors, because if we don't take in their perspective, the laws may be arbitrary. It may be unfair, it may be unimplementable. So public participation, which is meaningful, that means you provide them a platform to ventilate, discuss their issues, and you also provide feedback on their feedback. So if they give you a feedback, and if you think that a particular comment is not very relevant, or they don't have the right information, you give them access to the information so that they can make more informed positions. So that's one angle of meaningful public participation, where the platform is created and it's a meaningful and transparent process. The second element of public participation, which is very, very important, is all the actors. So if the platform is there, but people don't actually go and contribute, then again, it would fail, and the rule of law above would be compromised if a good, strong, sound, practical, applicable piece of legislation cannot be developed. Again, there would be problems. So earlier I asked how many of you would willingly take part in public survey. So there are a few elements to that question. There's no right or wrong answer. So more often than not, when the government is, say, introducing a new policy, or they want to develop a new piece of law, in some instances, they would open it up for public surveys to please provide your feedback. How many of us are actually providing feedback? So providing feedback is one thing, and on the authority side, them responding to a feedback. So we also want to know, right, that when we provide feedback, that our feedback is actually not just being put aside and documented and not being considered. So we would also want to know what's happening to our feedback. That's the element of meaningful public participation. It's a two-way street. No other way about it. And lastly is effective institutions and accountability. So just earlier when I asked, why do you think some of the laws are not being implemented and why are there problems? Someone mentioned about there are like overlapping institutions or there unclarity in the law. So this is where it comes back to institutional effectiveness. In Malaysia, we have another piece of law called the Ministerial Functions Act. And this piece of law actually dictates which ministry has what purview. So this ministry is responsible for subject matter ABCD. So that provides them, again, another set of rules as to how they administer the sector that they are in. But because the environment is not black and white, you cannot draw geometric lines over the environment and say, this is my area and that's your area. There's bound to be overlaps. Mechanisms need to be in place to ensure that those overlaps and where gaps exist are addressed. And second, to make sure that there is accountability and effectiveness, there also needs to be a mechanism to monitor the level of, we may have 200 pieces of legislation, but how effectively have those policies and legislation and plans been implemented? It needs to be monitored and reported on to show the progress. So for example, at a national level, we have the National Policy on Biological Diversity. By international law standards under the Convention on Biological Diversity, Malaysia has to send in frequent update reports. So that report is one way we can open and see, okay, where do we stand with respect to this set targets within the National Policy in Biological Diversity. If you're interested, please go and Google it. The document has been uploaded. It's available for anyone to read it. So that gives you an idea of, okay, from the National Policy in Bio-D, where we stand at the moment, how much we have achieved. So then we get to see, are the measures effective? What is lacking? And what are institutions planning to do, or what are actors planning to do to address those gaps? So next, I would just like to highlight some topical issues which touch on some of these elements. So I'll run through them. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Shantini,
Hold on,
you may.
just give me a minute. A second.
Yeah, we may need to speed up a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I think I won't go through all the, I will not go through all the issues. So this one is, all right, so we have a law which prohibits the harassment or the catching of certain threatened species, but we still get threatened species being caught in nets. Whether it's accidental or whether it's intentional, it's still getting caught. Why? So earlier I said about implementable laws. If we have laws to protect the species, have there been measures to actually identify what kind of gears are actually catching this threatened species accidentally? Where are the hot spots where these threatened species are aggregating, and is there a way that we can manage fishing activities, for example, which can stay away from these hotspots? At present, some of those measures are not in place. For turtles, for example, they have introduced gear modification. So they have something called a turtle excluded device on certain fishing nets, so that if a turtle accidentally gets caught, it can go out. But it does not necessarily exist for all other species. So the law may not necessarily be very implementable because management measures might be missing. Next, please. So next would be, all right, this is a very important target under the Sustainable Development Goals. It talks about sustainable ocean management as a whole. So now earlier we said that there's so many institutions and so many actors. If everybody manages their own activities based on what they're doing, who is going to be providing oversight into the cumulative impact of the marine, all the marine activities on the oceans? At present, as far as I'm aware, there's no single entity who's doing this. So to me personally, I feel this is a huge gap in Malaysia, but because we are highly terrestrial in nature, we live on land, we live close to forests, we are closer and we have a closer affinity to terrestrial issues and marine issues which relate to where we go and dive, where we swim, or where we go to coastal areas, because that's the closest to us. But the overall picture of marine environmental governance, the voices in this area is actually not there. So next, please. Maybe I can skip this one. Okay.
Slide 36.
You're doing selected issue 6, is it?
4. Selected issue 4, but slide 36.
Okay, hold on. My slides rang. Okay. So again, we have an example of an is this the Department of Fisheries and
yes,
right,
and
right.
the
So
land issue, yeah.
Yes, so we have again an overlap in jurisdiction. Fisheries runs up to the land. The waters run up to where water touches the land, the coast, and land under the state law covers land which runs up to 3 nautical miles. It includes land covered by water. Next slide, please. So you can see that these are the definitions under a federal piece of law and a state piece of law. So for example, if a state wants to reclaim a piece of land in the coast, it will actually be impacting Malaysian fisheries waters. So in this instance, who actually has the say and how do you resolve this issue? So these are challenges which are ongoing. There are various administrative processes that are in place, but it continues to be a challenge from an environmental front when we are trying to deal with these issues. Okay, next slide, I can skip. I want to do this one. Slide
Spatial planning.
Okay, all right. So now one of the measures for actual one of the tools that we can use to enhance marine environmental governance is spatial tools. So we have the National Physical Plan I spoke about earlier. And in Malaysia, if you look at this map, it actually has identified something called environmentally sensitive areas. And a lot of these areas are terrestrial, and there are selected areas which are in marine protected areas, but they're tiny. Why? This environmental sensitive area uses a rank system. And in this rank system, it's got rank 1, rank 2, rank 3. It has very heavy focus on logging and agriculture. So rank 1, it says no development. Rank 2, it says something like you cannot develop, but you can carry out sustainable logging. Rank 3, okay, then there is more regulation. So where would marine activities feature within rank 2 and rank 3? Now I'm moving to the next slide. So do you remember earlier, Dr. Louisa was talking about IMMAs. And she was telling, I think someone asked about where to get the shapefile and so forth. So again, policy needs to be informed by science. And we have been working, when I say we, I mean WWF-Malaysia has been working for the last few years, and we've been trying to see how we can get more representation of our marine areas within our physical plans, so that when we plan coastal use, we plan marine use, we can factor considerations. Okay, these are where the environmental hotspots are, where the biodiversity is largely concentrated. So what measures need to be put in place either to reduce noise pollution, to reduce coastal pressure and so forth. So there are 3 large environmental areas that have been recognized internationally through a peer-reviewed process or through scientific-based expeditions. These include the Coral Triangle scientific boundary, which is in Sabah waters. It includes IMMAs, the important marine mammal areas, and also something called ecologically and biologically significant areas. And those are areas which have been identified by scientists collectively through a peer-reviewed system under the Convention on Biological Diversity. These areas are already submitted and already recognized internationally, but they are largely not represented within our physical plans at the moment. Why? Again, because it's possible that there's not enough voice translating the science into the needed policies. So this is, okay, this one, I think I can skip this, it's fine, it's fine.
Okay.
So I just want to touch a little bit on the future of conservation in terms of where we are at and what needs to happen so that we can strengthen marine environmental governance very briefly. Okay, so to be able to move forward, while earlier in the initial stage in setting the scene, I had already identified what we need to know, it's sometimes more important to know what we don't know. I think Aristotle said that. So when you know your knowledge gaps, when you know your management gaps, you know your enforcement gaps, where these gaps are, then you can actually enhance policies, you can enhance legislation to be more effective. If we continue to neglect these gaps, we will never be able to deliver on proper policies and proper laws. So for example, if there is lack of scientific data, we don't know where the hotspot, say, for dolphins is, then we will not be able to effectively protect dolphins. We may protect dolphins in one area, but then the dolphin doesn't just stay in one area. It may be migrating and moving across different areas throughout its life cycle. So all these gaps need to be addressed, and there needs to be corresponding measures, be it law, be it finance, be it research. And although these disciplines are standalone, these enablers for promoting research, for ensuring finance is directed for conservation, it requires a governance framework. So under the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, is there promotion of scientific development for marine conservation such that it can help inform policy? So for example, even with finance, when government gives out money, I don't know how many of you know this, but when federal budgets are allocated, one of the main criteria when they allocate finance to states, it's based on the length of roads and population. What about biodiversity? Should that not also be a parameter? So WWF and a few other agencies have been advocating that we need to start considering financial allocations to states to also protect and conserve biodiversity, because one of the highest reasons, I mean, one of the strongest reasons for which states usually convert habitats or convert land or carry out practices for habitat conversion is because they need more resources. If they put up a condo by a coastal area, it'll bring in revenue. If they convert a forest, they can bring in more revenue. So it's because the value of environment has not been appreciated as much. So the economists, environmental economists need to help build a case for what the true value of our natural capital is. The financial community can look into how we can integrate environmental-based accounting into accounting systems so that when we account our balance sheet, our profits and losses and assets, that it actually factors in that when I'm creating a product, it may have a polluting impact. How do I factor that as part of my cost? Because it's not just about revenue. We will oversee all these key features if we only look at it from one angle. And these disciplines like environmental accounting, sustainable finance needs to be a discipline that grows in Malaysia and everywhere else, I suppose. So this is where a multidisciplinary approach is needed. All right, so my last couple of slides, a vision. I always say that our oceans is akin to an orchestra. So every sector is an instrument. You play a particular music. Imagine if you go to an orchestra and you find out the musicians have no score sheet and no conductor, and someone just says play. What kind of music will you get? So there needs to be a song sheet so that we can come up with a harmonious melody. And this song sheet has, at the national level, could look like a national ocean policy. But at the sector-based level, we need to look into ways of how we can mainstream marine biodiversity conservation into the sector. So when I'm looking into fisheries, how do I mainstream environmental factors? Now, people are carrying out light fishing in the fishing areas. They use lights to attract the fish. But is this light actually damaging other species, and is it damaging the ecology as a whole? How do I factor those considerations, mainstreaming them into, say, the fishery sector or even other sectors when I'm developing a property development? How do I feature biode conservations? Will this add on to erosion issues? So this song sheet needs to happen at every level, even at an organizational level. So say I work with WWF. In WWF, what are our environmental, social, and governance safeguards that we are putting in place? So it doesn't matter if you're an NGO, you're a business, you're a social enterprise, you need to think of your sustainability musical score, so that things can be more holistic. Next one, please. So as an example, all right, I'm going to skip this.
Okay.
All right, this is what I was talking about, the score. I think I ran a slide earlier, so I'm going to skip this as well. I'm just going to go to my last slide.
Slide 40.
Okay.
47, I mean.
47.
47 now.
Yeah.
All right, so now we spoke about a score. Now we need a champion in terms of a conductor. So each and every one of you, every one of us are actors. So in our own right, we are conductors and we are champions, whether we are championing for a national level institution who will charter the way forward for ocean governance in Malaysia, whether it's you as future industry leaders, or you as leaders within your community. What would you like to see happen? If you are in a planning capacity, would you want to integrate marine spatial planning, for example, to include all those IMMAs, the CTI areas and EPSA areas, any other areas into your planning process? These are just examples of what we can do as champions within our own communities. My last slide. So I've always been a very strong believer in the Rukun Negara. You know, we recite this every week in school. I don't know about you guys, but this is what we used to recite in school. And every single principle within the Rukun Negara is equally applicable, and it actually affirms environmental governance. So I hope that we can imbibe and inculcate these principles, that we follow, adhere to the Constitution, the rule of law, morality through self-governance and so forth. So that's just the end of the presentation session.
Okay.